Hi everyone, here's the book chemist once again. I tend to read not just Italian books, but books written in Romance languages, more broadly speaking, in the Italian translation over the English, on the assumption that the Italian translation of a French or Spanish novel is probably going to be closer to the original than an English translation. A consequence of that is that whenever I'm reading a book in Italian and whenever I'm loving that book, I always have this sense of dread that I'm going to find out after I've read the book that there's no English translation available, because that means I won't be able to gush about it here on the YouTube channel. This happened recently with Happy Are the Happy by Yasmina Reza, an amazing, hilarious novel of midlife crisis that packs the same hysterical punch of an Updike or a Richard Yates novel in a very elegant, very slim format. And an English translation does exist for Happy Are the Happy, and if you can get your hands on it, you should read it. It's amazing, it's heartbreaking and hilarious, but it's, as far as I could tell, very hard to find, so it seemed pointless to film a full review, recommend a novel that most of you won't be able to source. I had the same dread when I was reading The Art of Losing. Luckily, Art of Losing is much easier to obtain, and it's one of those books you just have to read if you trust me, because it's a fantastic, amazing novel. The Art of Losing is an engrossing and gorgeous family saga that is very emotional and very warm, but that is also clear-eyed enough to tackle some of the main dilemmas and enigmas of history, of identity, and very much of existence in a way that is very nuanced and complex, but always feels immediate and understandable. This is the story of a family from Kabylia, a region of Algeria, who in the 1950s find themselves inevitably tangled in the violence and the conflict and the struggle between the French army and the French government, who at the time ruled Algeria as a colony, and the FLN rebels, guerrilla rebels, trying to obtain independence for the country. As a consequence of this war of independence, life in the village where the protagonists live is disrupted. This life of timeless traditions, of very clear power dynamics, of ritual, of stability, is suddenly torn apart, it is suddenly upended. And Ali, the patriarch of the family, has to choose, to make a choice between these warring factions, and he ends up choosing the wrong side. He ends up siding with the French army instead of the FLN, with very long-lasting consequences for his family. This summary I just gave you, however necessary, does not make any sort of justice to the novel whatsoever. If you've read the book, it's probably not going to make any sense, because one of the central concerns of The Art of Losing, of Zeniter's novel, is that this idea that Ali chooses a side is ridiculous and preposterous and really doesn't capture the truth of living through such a moment of conflict, of fratricidal conflict, as a war for independence. The situation that Ali faces and that he has to cope with is so tangled and messy and colored by his own situation, his own ethnic and cultural identity, his own experience and his own personal history. It's tinged and influenced by all these things, and the idea that he is just that you can reduce the situation to a black and white dynamic of two opposing factions is ridiculous. Even though history will have a very narrow view and a very strong view on people like him, who sided, Algerians who sided with the French side during this conflict, during the War of Independence. History will certainly not be kind to them. The parallels between this novel and other engrossing, fantastic works of Historical fiction, other family sagas, the parallels abound. I could mention personal favorite, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, because both books show characters who use comic books, especially, as a way of coping and coming to grips with a traumatic uprooting from their native lands and with the feelings of guilt, with the inner turmoil that comes from having to build a new life in a completely different country, a different place. Comics allow these characters to make sense of their condition, their reality, and their experiences. The two novels, however, that came to mind most frequently as I was reading Zeniter's novel were Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides and The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. Middlesex, because of its structure first and foremost, a structure, by the way, that Middlesex borrows from Sterne, from Tristram Shandy. This is a family saga where the alleged protagonist of the novel only really steps into the narrative halfway through, and we spend a good chunk of the early novel actually learning about her forerunners, her grandfather and her father. Both Middlesex and The Art of Losing are also novels that shed a light on a turbulent historical moment that is maybe not widely known, or at least a historical moment that I didn't know much about at all. In this case, of course, we're talking about the Algerian War for Independence. In Middlesex, it's the Turkish-Greek conflict in the early 20th century. And they're books that talk about the immigrant experience in ways that are heartfelt and very candid, but they're also unsentimental. The Art of Losing, for instance, is fairly frank when it comes to discussing some of the most unpalatable and even horrid aspects of the culture from which this family comes from, at the same time as it describes some of the rituals and the beauty of the culture that they will be forced to leave behind. The Sympathizer comes to mind because it's another novel that deals with a marginalized group that is rarely discussed and that is often excluded from mainstream historical conversations, a group that is broadly tagged as traitors, as sympathizers indeed. In that case, it's the South Vietnamese people who supported the South Vietnamese government in the war between North and South Vietnam. Both novels deal with immigrant communities who maintain a strong connection to their native land and try to carry on their life and bring their traditions with them in the new land, while at the same time knowing that they're unlikely to ever be able to go back to that land. And this strange process where they almost actively try to forget it while preserving the life they led up to the point of leaving that land. It's a dynamic rife with inner conflict, and it's quite a complex dynamic that is captured beautifully in both books. The Art of Losing, to paraphrase the novel itself, is a book that deals with situations that cannot be described except with contradictory statements. And to me, that is the highest task that fiction can aspire to, capturing and exploring the contradictions and the complexities of existence. It's a novel that is steeped in history, but also engages with shifts in the contemporary world, in the recent world. It engages, for instance, with the backlash in France, witnessed by French Muslim citizens after terror attacks, the undeserved backlash that they receive, for instance, after the Bataclan attacks and other terrorist attacks in France. It engages with how connected 20th century history is with the current dynamics and the current trends that we're seeing with the rise of far-right parties, with these unresolved questions coming back to the surface. I think it's a fantastic novel, and I couldn't recommend it more highly. It's also one of those novels that I would recommend to any reader out there. It's warm and insightful and complex enough that I think everybody will find something satisfying in it. I look forward to hearing what you think. If you're a fan of Art of Losing, I really look forward to discussing it with you in the comments. And thank you as always for watching this review. Thanks to my patrons for supporting the YouTube channel. And bye everybody.